Welcome to the big inflation debate. We have Summer with us to talk about this intriguing topic. Let's just get started with the discussion. Summer, if you could throw some light on why is inflation such an important topic? Why is everyone talking about it almost always, right? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So yeah, Sanjali, I mean, why we also when we were discussing like what to get started with, I think inflation is really a hot debate right now, right? Globally, you talk to anybody, people are worried about inflation, or some people are not worried about it, but the big reason I think is because it really affects you the most directly. So every person goes to the supermarket, grocery, restaurants, and they see the prices rising, which they are not that used to for past few years. I think this is the one thing related to economics that hits you really in your face almost every day. So that's why this is also a topic of debate very commonly almost everywhere. And right now, I think the big debate that is going on is is inflation going to make the whole world go into this Argentina-like scenario, which was hyperinflation, or have we gotten to a soft landing, or what's the story? So I think it really is a big. Uh, I mean, as people say, governments get uh, dislodged mostly on inflation more than anything else. Like if you look at Indian election, it was really fought on inflation and poor people not having enough opportunities rather than anything else. So yeah, that's why it's very important.
Okay, so before we dive into it a little deeper, how about you tell us a little bit about where are we with respect to inflation? Like, where were we
Hmm.
and where are we today?
Sure. So see, let's start with COVID, right? I think that's where the timeline really starts because before that it was all like kind of going as it was going. So obviously COVID came, the whole economic activity slumped, inflation obviously, kind of just went to almost zero for the first few months. Then, obviously the whole world realized that the world is going to be in trouble economically speaking because of the zero economic output. So everybody started printing money, right? So inflation started increasing, and so if you look at that chronology for almost a year, 2 years, inflation increased very high. So before COVID, the inflation used to be. So I'm talking about U.S. inflation. That's kind of the benchmark. The other world sort of follows it, but let's talk about U.S. inflation numbers because they're easy to talk about. So 2 to 3% was the benchmark where inflation used to stay, and that's what Fed kept it for quite a lot of time. And this inflation, when the money printing started, inflation rose up to almost 8%. That was the peak, right? And then, obviously that's a big number because at 8%, especially 8% is the average number. In some things like grocery and stuff, there was even higher inflation. And, that really hits people very hard. So at that point, Fed started to increase the interest rates very aggressively, and inflation obviously started to fall, and now we have come down to somewhere between 3, like 3.5 is the average. So if you look at the last 4 quarters, the number keeps jumping from 3 to 4%, right? And I think obviously the big debate is 3% okay? Like, I mean, why was 2% the 2%? Because it was actually pretty arbitrary. Like everybody was happy that 2% is keeping things sane. Growth is also there, and people are also not really very burdened by the rising prices. So 2% was fine. Now 3% seems to be that new benchmark which the Fed is not able to get the inflation below from, right? So it's not, so Fed wants the inflation to go to 2.5%, but they're just not able to do it. So that's
So,
where we are
just
right now.
understood. So, just to understand this a little deeper, What increases inflation? How does it increase?
Yeah. So see, so honestly, like there are two big factors which are really playing into inflation. I mean, at this point, right, I'll talk about. Uh, One is the money printing, right? Low interest rates for quite some time before, before COVID, and after COVID came, like, they were like literally free money given to almost every person. So that, people have too much surplus money, especially money they have not worked for, and they started spending more money, and everything gets more expensive. So that's, I think, the most obvious one. The second thing that is probably more more consistent and is happening even now is the geopolitics. So if you see, there is Ukraine war going on, there is Israel Palestine going on, there is war in Sudan going on, then there is war in Yemen going on. And pretty much all these wars, they have one common thing, right? Which is US on one side, US, NATO, and the allies on one side, and China, Russia, Iran sort of on other side, right? There are a lot of non-aligned or sort of, neutral countries like India, uh, but it's so the world is actually going towards almost, you can say, like a World War III like situation, right? Because all these wars are essentially very, very concerted, like, correlated. So you see, what happens in Israel is directly correlated with what happens in Yemen, right? The Houthis are also firing missiles on the vessels that are going to Israel and stuff. So essentially, it's, these two groups of people, of big superpowers fighting each other, and because of that, obviously, trade has become more expensive because insurance on shipping has gone up very high, etc., etc. And because of this war or wars, the prices of things are not coming down as people expect they should have come down by now.
Got it. So, if you could touch upon the expanse of this problem, how big a problem is inflation, and like, how vast does it go?
Honestly, I think it's super, super big. The biggest problem with inflation is that it doesn't affect, the richest, right? It only affects the middle class and below. I mean, rich people are fine because, they never really won't. I mean, food can be whatever price, but they won't really think about buying food because it's a very small percentage of their total spend, right? But if you talk about a middle class family, if you talk about a lower income group family, right? For them, it's a big issue because food, clothing, basics of life are much more important for them. And when the prices increase in this area, I think they get affected the most. And another issue that is happening is, see, all the money, so the thesis is that you print money, you give it to poor people, right? They'll be able to drive economy up, and essentially do more stuff and, become richer, or social mobility happens. But that's not happening. What is happening, if you give people, money, they'll buy TVs, they'll buy cars, they'll buy whatever, and all that money gets concentrated to the top few companies. So, if you think about it, 5 years ago, $1 trillion company was a big deal. And right now, there are so many of them. Like, every third day, there is another company talking about becoming $1 trillion company because all the money that's printing, that's getting pumped into the economy, trickles up to these large companies very, very quickly. So I think that's, it's not directly related to inflation, but actually is more about concentration of wealth. But it actually leads to the same problem that, the bottom layer or the lower middle class and below, they don't have enough money for their daily expenditure and stuff like that. So, and another interesting fact is that for the first time, almost all of the Western world, children are poorer than their parents. So if you think about it, so we have always just assumed, at least, um, everywhere in the world, that the the next generation is going to be more prosperous than the previous generation. But in the most of the West, that is actually changing. That's not true at this point. In India, luckily, it's true, but not in most of the Western world. So that's also related to inflation in a way, because the wages are not increasing, prices of things are increasing, so effectively they can afford less things, and as a result are less productive.
You started off by talking about how inflation has reduced from COVID to now, from an 8% to a 3-4%. How has that happened? And is it going to continue to decrease the way it is? Could you throw some light on that?
Well, I mean, so the inflation decreased because US stopped the low interest rate. So essentially, the way US was printing money was not really like literally printing money, but the interest rates were just too low, right? And they were just giving money to people as bonuses or like unemployment or stuff like that. So when they stopped doing that and they started increasing the interest rates, so obviously that led to the inflation starting to come down. But ideally, what should have happened is that should have reduced the amount of jobs that were being created, right? So unemployment should have ideally gone up, because it's not a good thing, but generally when you increase interest rates, businesses find it more difficult to do their business, hire more people, and essentially jobs come down. But that has not happened because there was like a huge pent up vacuum in the US job market, right? And what essentially happened was that there were these very high paying tech jobs which got rationalized a bit, which a lot of people lost their job from those jobs. But the lower value jobs, essentially, the waiters, the cleaners, the drivers, those jobs actually increased a lot, right? So essentially, on an overall scenario, the job market has been pretty robust, because of which the inflation is not coming down as much as it should have, uh, from a which is a good thing actually. I mean, the lower level jobs are more important for economy in terms of social justice, so to speak, for the lack of better word. So I think from that perspective, it's that's the place we are stuck in right now. That because more jobs are being created and more vacancies are also there in US. So inflation is not coming below 3.5%, even at these high interest rates. If you think about it, like 5% interest rate has not been there for quite some time in US.
So, on this note, what is going to happen to jobs in the future? What's going to be the way of living with respect to jobs in that case?
So see, ideally, what is happening is there are a few things happening, right? One is that tech, I mean, especially this AI thing, a lot of people are thinking that AI might just reduce the need for jobs altogether. I don't think that's really the case at this point. I mean, but the idea is that tech is super deflationary, right? So what is happening is, if you look at a mobile phone, right? A phone has, let's say, devices worth maybe $50,000, from ten years ago, right? 10 years ago, you needed like all these new fancy things, a good DSLR camera, etc., etc. But today, all of that is in your phone. So what essentially it means is that, you know, it has reduced a lot of money that you would have had to spend to have the same quality of living, right? So because of so same analogy applies almost everywhere else. So so same thing with phone calls, right? I mean, earlier we used to 10 years ago we had to do international calls. It was so expensive. Today it's virtually free. Like who buys international phone minutes anymore, right? So because of these things, technology is super deflationary, right? And we are going towards a point where I think that eventually there'll be abundance, right? So all the mining and all the, you know, oil drilling, all the agriculture, m- very few people will be needed to do these, right? Let's say 10% of what. are needed today, because AI, machines, robots will do most of the stuff. And what will happen is, because of this, most people will actually not be needed to do a job, right? But mostly they'll just do what they want to do, right? Which is like they'll focus on hobbies, they'll focus more on their um, you know craft. I mean, for example, handmade leather goods, right? I mean, they might just become super expensive. Not everybody would buy them, because there'll be still a lot of robot made. I mean, even today that's the case, right? In the robot made factory stuff, a lot of that stuff is super cheap. But if you want a very good handmade leather wallet or something, you have to pay a premium. So I think that is going to happen in pretty much every instance. And handmade stuff is more going to be related to you know our hobbies and craft, rather than just the necessity of it. So I think that's the direction we are going in. And actually, in that on that direction, there's this interesting example I read somewhere. So if you read about any empires that were prosperous, so let's say talk about Roman Empire, right? Super prosperous. And if you think about Rome at the time of Roman Empire, it was almost like a abundance, right? It was like almost like a utopia, because Rome, the city, had so much wealth, because from all over the world, the wealth was getting concentrated in Rome, or pretty much any ancient capital, right? And what happens is those cities become more like utopias, right? Everybody has pretty much everything, or at least a strata has. So what people do at that point is they start focusing more on art, they start focusing more on literature, they start focusing on these gladiator games. People start playing a lot of games, entertainment. So all these things become super super important for those people. And the new stars, or new powerful people, are the sports people, are the artists, are the crafts people, rather than the merchants, so to speak, right? So I think that is you know a glimpse of history that could be repeated. And eventually, if abundance comes globally because of AI, I think that could be the direction we are looking at. And that's my optimistic view, honestly. And there are people with a very pessimistic views also, but I think I hope, or I think that's the direction where we are going.
Yeah, let's keep up with the optimism for now.
Yeah.
Uh, but thanks, Amit. That was a very insightful conversation. I'm glad we did this, and yeah, everyone, please remember to like and share this content so that we can continue to create such content in the future as well for you. And don't forget to subscribe the page. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again next week.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Shanjali. It was pretty nice doing this.
Thanks,
Okay.
Amit.
Okay. So